In the final days of 1989, the regime of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu collapsed with unexpected speed. The couple that had governed Romania with absolute control was captured, taken to a military base and subjected to an improvised trial. Without guarantees, without appeals, and without time for defense, the death sentence was decided in barely minutes, and the execution was carried out immediately. The accusations spoke of hunger imposed on the population, bloody repression, and a personalist dictatorship that had brought the country to its limit. Elena was not treated as an accomplice, but as a protagonist of that system. She participated in key decisions, controlled power structures, and firmly sustained the repression. For the tribunal, her responsibility was inseparable from Nicolae's. Was it an act of justice or a political execution? Why was Elena considered as dangerous as her husband? The seed of power, the unstoppable rise of Nicolae and Elena. In the first decades of the 20th century, Romania was a predominantly agricultural country where 90% of the population lived in the countryside. Nicolae Ceaușescu was born on January 26, 1918 in Scornicești, a village in the Olt region, south of the country. He was the third of 10 children in a peasant family that worked other people's lands as tenants. His father, Andruța Ceaușescu, combined agricultural work with trades such as carpentry. The family lived in an adobe house without electricity or running water. Nicolae attended the village primary school until he was 11 years old, when he abandoned his studies to move to Bucharest. In 1929, he was sent to the capital to learn the shoemaker's trade in a workshop in the Calia Griviței neighborhood. Bucharest in the 30s concentrated the tensions of a society in transformation. Industrialization was advancing slowly, creating a new working class that worked in precarious conditions. Wages were low, working days were long, and union rights were limited. In this environment, socialist and communist ideas found echo among young workers like Nicolae. The Communist Party of Romania operated underground since 1924. The monarchy had declared it illegal due to its links with the Communist International of Moscow. This underground situation forced militants to develop conspiratorial methods and strict organizational discipline. Nicolae joined the communist youth at 15 years old, participating in propaganda activities and union organization. His first arrest occurred in 1933 during a workers' demonstration in Bucharest. The police identified him as a distributor of communist pamphlets. Between 1933 and 1938, he was arrested on several occasions for subversive activities. He spent periods in prisons such as Caransabej, Jilava, and Doftana, penitentiary centers where he coincided with other communist militants. In Doftana prison, he met Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej, a communist leader with more experience who would become his political mentor. Gheorghiu Dej had led the railway strike of 1933 in Grivița and enjoyed prestige within the underground party. The relationship between both was consolidated during the years of shared imprisonment, establishing bonds that would be decisive for Nicolae's subsequent rise. The prisons functioned as spaces of political formation for Romanian communists. Political prisoners organized clandestine seminars, discussed Marxist theory, and planned future activities. Nicolae participated in these educational activities, although his role was mainly listening and observing. His profile was that of a disciplined militant, but without outstanding personal initiative. In 1939, during a temporary release, Nicolae met Elena Petrescu at a dance organized by the communist youth. Elena had been born on January 7, 1916 in Petresti, a village in Dâmbovița County. Like Nicolae, she came from a poor peasant family and had moved to Bucharest to work in the textile industry. Elena worked in a spinning factory where working conditions were particularly harsh. Working days extended 12 hours daily. Wages were insufficient to cover basic needs, and workplace safety measures were practically non-existent. Her incorporation into leftist political activities responded both to ideological convictions and to the search for improvements in her living and working conditions. The relationship between Nicolae and Elena developed in the context of shared political militancy. They participated together in clandestine meetings, distribution of propaganda, and organization of union activities. This political dimension of their personal bond would be a permanent characteristic of their relationship. They married on December 23, 1947, after 8 years of courtship interrupted by arrests and periods of clandestinity. World War II radically transformed the Romanian political situation. In 1940, the country ceded territories to the Soviet Union, Hungary and Bulgaria under pressure from the Axis powers. General Ion Antonescu established a military dictatorship allied with Nazi Germany. Communists were harshly persecuted, with many leaders imprisoned or executed. Nicolae was detained again in 1940 and transferred to the Târgu Jiu internment camp in 1943. He remained there until August 1944, when King Michael I ordered Antonescu's arrest and changed the Romanian alliance toward the Allied countries. The Soviet Red Army entered Romania, and the Communist Party emerged from clandestinity with foreign military backing. After his release, Nicolae was designated Regional Secretary of the Communist Youth Union for Bucharest. This function allowed him to participate in the massive recruitment of new militants and in the organization of demonstrations supporting the new regime. The Youth Union became an instrument of political mobilization and social control over young Romanians. In the November 1946 elections, the Democratic Party's bloc, dominated by communists, obtained 70% of the votes according to official results. The opposition denounced massive irregularities and electoral coercion. In December 1947, King Michael was forced to abdicate, and the People's Republic of Romania was proclaimed. The political system came under absolute communist control. Nicolae took advantage of this context to consolidate his position within the party apparatus. In 1948, he was appointed Undersecretary in the Ministry of Agriculture, a position that provided him with experience in state management and access to resource distribution. 2 years later, he moved to the Ministry of Defense as Vice Minister, reaching the military rank of Division General at 32 years old. Elena followed a parallel but initially subordinate trajectory. She worked in union organizations and in party structures destined for female mobilization. Her academic training was limited. She had completed only 4 years of primary education before joining industrial work. However, her position as wife of a rising leader provided her with growing influence within political circles. In 1952, Nicolae entered the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party. This appointment placed him among the country's first-level leaders. During the 50s, he participated in the internal purges that consolidated Gheorghiu Deja's power, eliminating real or potential political competitors. His role was mainly executive. He implemented decisions made by others, but without questioning fundamental political lines. Stalin's death in 1953 and the de-Stalinization process initiated by Nikita Khrushchev generated tensions within the Soviet bloc. Gheorghiu Dej maneuvered to maintain autonomy regarding Moscow, especially in economic policy. Nicolae supported these maneuvers without assuming public protagonism, consolidating his reputation as a reliable executor of superior directives. Between 1954 and 1965, Nicolae performed various functions related to party organization, military supervision, and coordination of security structures. His specialty was inspection and control of cadres, functions that provided him with detailed knowledge of the internal functioning of the state and party apparatus. This experience would be fundamental for his subsequent consolidation as supreme leader. Gheorghiu Deja's death in March 1965 opened a succession competition within the Romanian Communist Party. Nicolae was considered a continuity candidate without declared enemies within the different party factions. His profile as a disciplined militant, without apparent ambitions for radical renewal, made him an acceptable option for leaders who desired to maintain stability in the established political system. On March 22, 1965, Nicolae Ceaușescu was elected first secretary of the Romanian Communist Party. 2 years later, in 1967, he assumed the presidency of the State Council, concentrating functions of head of state and party leader. Elena began to participate in middle-level party structures, preparing the ground for her subsequent political rise. A different dictatorship between Moscow and the West. The first international crisis that Nicolae Ceaușescu faced as Romanian leader defined his foreign policy during the following 2 decades. On August 20, 1968, Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia to suppress Alexander Dubček's liberalizing reforms known as the Prague Spring. While Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and East Germany participated in the military operation, Romania abstained and publicly condemned the invasion. On August 21st, Ceaușescu delivered a speech in Republic Square in Bucharest before 200,000 citizens convened by the party. He declared that the invasion violated Czechoslovak sovereignty and the principles of equality among socialist nations. He rejected any doctrine that would justify military intervention in other countries' internal affairs. The crowd responded with prolonged applause and shouts of support for the Romanian leader. This independent stance transformed Ceaușescu's international image. Western governments that had maintained cold relations with Bucharest began to see in him a valuable interlocutor within the Soviet bloc. European and American press described him as the communist leader who dared to challenge Moscow. This perception translated into high-level diplomatic invitations that reinforced the Romanian regime's prestige. On May 10, 1968, French President Charles de Gaulle visited Bucharest, becoming the first Western leader to do so since the installation of the communist regime. De Gaulle sought to diversify French alliances in the context of his policy of independence regarding Washington and Moscow. The signed agreements included industrial cooperation, cultural exchange, and financial credits amounting to 300 million francs. A year later, US President Richard Nixon made an official visit to Romania, the first by an American president to a Warsaw Pact country after World War II. Nixon arrived in Bucharest on August 2, 1969, received by organized crowds cheering through the capital's streets. The signed trade agreements granted Romania preferential access to Western technology and credit lines from the US Export-Import Bank. These diplomatic openings provided the Romanian regime with significant financial resources. Between 1968 and 1978, Romania received loans worth $6 billion from Western institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The funds were officially destined for heavy industrialization projects that sought to modernize the country's economic structure. Parallel to this international balancing policy, Ceaușescu built his internal authority through a progressively elaborate personality cult. The first elements appeared around 1968, when state media began to refer to him with honorific titles. He was called conducător, the Romanian term for leader that evoked medieval princes who had resisted foreign dominations. Official propaganda established parallels between Ceaușescu and historical figures like Mircea the Old or Michael the Brave, medieval rulers presented as defenders of national independence. This nationalist narrative combined with orthodox Marxism to create a specifically Romanian ideology that justified autonomy regarding Moscow. The party did not question socialism, but proclaimed a Romanian national socialism under Ceaușescu's leadership. Elena Ceaușescu experienced accelerated political rise during this period. In 1968, she was appointed director of the National Institute of Chemical Research. Her appointment was justified by her experience in the textile industry, although her previous work had been operational. The position provided her with authority in a strategic sector of the Romanian economy. In 1972, Elena entered the executive committee of the Romanian Communist Party, the country's supreme political decision organ. The Ceaușescu couple began to function as a diarchy, with Nicolae concentrating political functions and Elena expanding her influence in technical and educational areas. During the 70s, the construction of Elena's cult followed similar patterns to her husband's. She was attributed non-existent scientific discoveries, academic publications she had not written, and international recognitions managed by Romanian diplomacy. European universities granted her honorary doctorates under pressure from their respective governments, interested in maintaining commercial relations with Bucharest. The Romanian repressive system developed simultaneously to these diplomatic maneuvers. The Securitate, secret police established in 1948, expanded its operations until reaching unprecedented social penetration in the Eastern Bloc. It is estimated that by 1975 it employed 40,000 full-time agents and 200,000 occasional informants to control a population of 21 million inhabitants. Surveillance methods included systematic interception of telephone communications, opening of postal correspondence, and installation of listening devices in private homes and workplaces. The informant network covered all social sectors: factories, universities, churches, cultural and sports organizations. Securitate reports documented private conversations, political opinions not expressed publicly, and behaviors considered deviant from official orthodoxy. Repression was applied through gradual methods designed to discourage opposition without generating visible political martyrs. Dissidents faced job loss, university expulsion, prohibition from publishing or traveling abroad. In more serious cases, brief detentions, psychological interrogations, and threats against relatives were applied. The objective was to create an atmosphere of self-censorship where the population would avoid any critical expression toward the regime. The most severe repression cases were reserved for attempts at independent political organization or unauthorized contacts with foreigners. Those convicted of these crimes served sentences in prisons like Aiud, Gela, or Râmnicu Sărat. Penitentiary centers where re-education methods were applied, including forced labor, prolonged isolation, and systematic psychological pressure. During this period, the regime's religious policy combined formal tolerance with effective control. Traditional churches maintained liturgical functions, but their activities were subject to state supervision. Sermons were censored, religious publications were severely limited, and religious education was prohibited outside temples. Priests had to obtain state authorization to exercise their ministry, which allowed eliminating clergy considered politically dangerous. Minority religious communities faced additional restrictions. Jehovah's Witnesses were completely proscribed, with their members subject to criminal persecution. Seventh-day Adventists and Baptists could function under strict state supervision. The Jewish community, decimated by the Holocaust and subsequent emigration, maintained community institutions but under Securitate control. The balance between international openness and internal repression was maintained throughout the 1970s decade. Ceaușescu participated in non-aligned countries' conferences, received Third World leaders, and maintained commercial relations with both the West and the Soviet bloc. This policy provided him with financial resources and international prestige that he used to consolidate his domestic authority. In 1974, Ceaușescu was designated President of the Socialist Republic of Romania, a new position created specifically for him that formalized his condition as head of state. The modified constitution concentrated broad executive powers in the presidency, eliminating effective parliamentary controls. Elena was appointed first vice president of the National Council of Science and Technology, a position that granted her authority over national scientific policy. Links with China intensified after the Sino-Soviet split. Ceaușescu visited Beijing in 1971, establishing privileged relations with Mao Zedong. The exchanges included technical, commercial, and military cooperation, but also ideological. The Chinese model of National Socialism, independent from Moscow, provided theoretical justification for the Romanian policy of autonomy within the socialist camp. Hunger and control, the nation changed by megalomania. In October 1966, Nicolae Ceaușescu signed Decree 770, one of the most controversial measures of his regime. The norm prohibited abortion and the use of contraceptive methods for women under 40 years old who had fewer than 4 children. Exceptions were limited to cases where pregnancy represented mortal risk for the mother or when serious fetal malformations were medically diagnosed. The decree established mandatory medical controls for women of reproductive age. Companies had to organize periodic gynecological examinations in their facilities, with participation of state doctors who monitored pregnancies and detected attempts at clandestine interruption. Hospitals received instructions to inform authorities about women who arrived with symptoms of abortions practiced outside the official medical system. Sanctions for violating the decree included fines equivalent to several months of average salary, both for women and for those who facilitated contraceptive methods or abortion procedures. Doctors who practiced illegal abortions faced loss of professional license and prison sentences of up to 5 years. Importation of contraceptives was prohibited, and national production was suspended except for controlled distribution in authorized cases. The demographic results were immediate. The birth rate, which had descended to 14 births per 1,000 inhabitants in 1966, rose to 28 per 1,000 in 1967. In 1968, 550,000 children were born, compared to the 273,000 of the year before the decree. These children were popularly known as the decree generation, or Ceaușescu's children. However, the Romanian social system was not prepared to absorb this sudden demographic increase. Wages remained stagnant, while the cost of living increased, especially in food and housing. Many families found themselves with more children than they could maintain economically. The situation worsened when single mothers, previously a minority, increased significantly due to contraceptive restrictions. State orphanages experienced unprecedented saturation. The number of institutionalized children went from 10,000 in 1966 to more than 100,000 in 1989. The facilities, designed for smaller capacities, operated with chronic overcrowding. In many centers, children slept in shared beds. Feeding was insufficient, and medical staff was scarce to attend basic health needs. Conditions in these orphanages deteriorated progressively during the 70s and 80s. State budgets destined for childcare did not increase proportionally to the increase in institutionalized population. Children received irregular medical attention, limited education, and rudimentary job preparation. Many remained in the institutional system until 18 years old, at which time they were released without resources or skills to integrate into society. Parallel to this, the decree generated a clandestine market for reproductive services. Desperate women resorted to homemade abortion methods that included medicinal plants, improvised instruments, and dangerous chemical substances. Procedures were performed in deficient hygienic conditions, frequently without adequate medical knowledge. It is estimated that between 3,000 and 10,000 women died annually from clandestine abortion complications during the decree's validity. Official doctors faced contradictory pressures. On one hand, they had to enforce the decree by reporting pregnancies and detecting violations. On the other, they knew the medical and social consequences of the contraceptive prohibition. Some developed informal codes to help patients in desperate situations, risking their professional careers. Others limited themselves to strictly complying with regulations to avoid legal repercussions. In 1971, Ceaușescu made an official visit to China and North Korea that deeply impacted his conception of political power. In Beijing, he was received by Mao Zedong, who explained the principles of the Chinese Cultural Revolution to him. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung showed him the North Korean personalized cult system and the methods of mass mobilization used in that country. Upon his return to Bucharest, Ceaușescu implemented what he called the July Theses, a political program that intensified ideological control over Romanian society. The document, published in July 1971, established that culture, education, and media should serve exclusively the construction of socialism under party direction. Western cultural influences considered bourgeois were eliminated, and nationalist propaganda was reinforced. The application of the theses transformed the Romanian cultural panorama. Publishing houses modified their publication plans, eliminating contemporary Western literature. Movie theaters reduced the programming of foreign films, substituting them with Romanian productions and those from other socialist countries. Television programs were oriented toward educational and propagandistic content, with considerable time dedicated to activities of the leader and his wife. The construction of Elena's scientific image followed systematic patterns of falsification during this period. Academic publications were created with her name as principal author, although the content was elaborated by teams of professional researchers. Romanian universities granted her doctoral titles without examinations or publicly defended theses. Foreign scientific institutions, pressured by diplomatic considerations, granted her honorary memberships and academic recognitions. In 1974, Elena was elected member of the Executive Political Committee of the Romanian Communist Party, the country's supreme decision organ. Her appointment was presented as recognition of her scientific and organizational contributions. In reality, it represented the formal consolidation of a diarchy where the couple shared effective political power. Nicolae maintained public leadership functions, while Elena controlled key sectors of state administration. During the second half of the 70s, the Romanian economic situation began to deteriorate due to external and internal factors. The oil crisis of 1973 raised energy costs, affecting heavy industry which constituted the core of the Romanian development model. Western loans, used to finance industrial projects, generated growing payment obligations denominated in hard currencies. Romanian foreign debt grew exponentially during this period. From $1 billion in 1970 It ascended to $10 billion in 1981. Interest and amortization payments absorbed growing percentages of export income. The Romanian economy became increasingly dependent on Western markets to generate the foreign currency necessary for debt service. In 1982, Ceaușescu announced his decision to completely cancel Romanian foreign debt before 1990. The goal was presented as an objective of national economic independence, freeing the country from foreign financial conditioning. To achieve it, austerity measures were implemented that drastically affected internal consumption and the population's living conditions. The forced export policy directed most of Romanian agricultural and industrial production toward external markets. Cereals, meat, dairy products, fuels and manufactures were sold abroad, while the internal market experienced generalized scarcity. State stores operated with minimal inventories, forcing citizens to form lines of several hours to acquire basic products when they were available. Food rationing was gradually institutionalized during the 80s. Authorities established monthly per capita quotas for articles like bread, milk, meat, sugar, and oil. The assigned quantities were insufficient to satisfy normal nutritional needs, especially for families with children. The black market for food expanded, but prices were prohibitive for most salaries. Energy restrictions affected both homes and workplaces. Electricity supply was limited to a few daily hours in residential zones, forcing families to reorganize their daily activities. Heating was suspended during most of winter, even when temperatures dropped several degrees below zero. Hot water was supplied only once or twice per week, complicating personal and domestic hygiene. Television programming was reduced to 2 daily hours, concentrated on newscasts and propagandistic programs about the ruling couple's activities. Content centered on visits to factories and collective farms, speeches at party meetings and official ceremonies. There were no entertainment, sports, or cultural programs that did not have explicit educational function according to official ideology. While the population faced these deprivations, the Ceaușescu couple maintained an ostentatious lifestyle that contrasted dramatically with the imposed austerity. They resided in multiple palaces equipped with imported luxuries, including French furniture, Persian tapestries, and Chinese porcelain tableware. Their wardrobes contained hundreds of suits and dresses by Western designers, constantly renewed to avoid repeating outfits in public appearances. In 1977, an earthquake of magnitude 7 degrees on the Richter scale devastated Bucharest, causing 1,500 deaths and extensive material damage. The capital's historic center was seriously affected, with dozens of buildings destroyed or irreparably damaged. Ceaușescu used this juncture to implement an urban remodeling project he had conceived years before. The reconstruction plan implied the demolition of approximately 1/5 of Bucharest's historic center, including entire neighborhoods with traditional Romanian architecture. 30 Orthodox churches, 2 synagogues, 3 monasteries, and more than 9,000 homes were scheduled for demolition. 40,000 residents received eviction orders, with minimal compensation and relocation in apartment blocks on the urban periphery. The central architectural project was the construction of the People's Palace, a government building designed to be the seat of Romanian political power and official residence of the ruling couple. The plans contemplated a structure of 365,000 square meters of built surface, with 1,000 rooms distributed on 12 visible floors and 8 underground. The dimensions would surpass those of the US Pentagon, making it the world's largest administrative building. Construction of the palace began in 1984, employing 20,000 workers in continuous 24-hour shifts. Materials included 1 million square meters of Carrara marble, 3,500 tons of crystal, 700 tons of steel and bronze for decorations, and 900 cubic meters of wood for parquet floors and panels. The carpets, woven specially for the project, covered 20,000 square meters of interior surfaces. The palace's cost was estimated at $2 billion according to prices of the era, an amount equivalent to approximately 10% of annual Romanian gross domestic product. Resources were diverted from sectors like health, education, and popular housing toward this pharaonic project. Construction continued during periods of greatest austerity, when the population experienced food rationing and severe energy restrictions. The palace's interior design reflected the megalomania tastes of the ruling couple. The main hall measured 2,000 square meters, with a ceiling 50 meters high decorated with Murano crystal chandeliers. The main staircases were of rose marble with gilded railings, while columns used varieties of marble imported from Italy and Greece. Private bedrooms and offices included marble bathtubs, golden faucets, and authentic Persian tapestries. During this period, Elena consolidated her position as the second figure of the Romanian state. In 1980, she was designated first vice president of the Council of Ministers, a position that formalized her participation in high-level government decisions. Her influence extended over key ministries like education, science, and technology, allowing her to control the formation of technical cadres and national scientific research. The final rebellion, the people against the dictator. In 1989, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe experienced transformations that altered the geopolitical balance established after World War II. In Poland, round-table negotiations between the government and the Solidarity Union culminated in partially free parliamentary elections held in June. In Hungary, the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party abandoned the power monopoly and opened borders with Austria, allowing the exodus of German Democratic Republic citizens. The German Democratic Republic faced an unprecedented migratory crisis when thousands of its citizens took advantage of the Hungarian opening to escape toward West Germany. Demonstrations intensified in cities like Leipzig and Dresden, where citizens demanded democratic reforms and freedom of movement. On November 9th, the Berlin Wall was torn down by crowds that authorities could not contain. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution developed between November and December under leadership of intellectuals grouped in the Civic Forum. Initial student protests transformed into mass mobilizations that forced the Communist Party to renounce power. Václav Havel, playwright and dissident, was elected president in December, symbolizing the peaceful transition toward democracy. Romania remained apparently immune to these changes. Nicolae Ceaușescu had been re-elected Secretary-General of the Communist Party in November during the 14th Congress, where delegates unanimously approved all presented resolutions. State media did not report on events in neighboring countries, keeping the Romanian population isolated from regional transformations. Elena Ceaușescu actively participated in the Congress deliberations, delivering a speech on scientific and educational policy. The ruling couple projected an image of absolute control over the state and party apparatus. However, social tensions accumulated during years of austerity began to manifest in isolated incidents that authorities contained through localized repression. In March, 6 former communist leaders sent an open letter criticizing economic policies and the personalist concentration of power. The document, known as the Letter of the Six, was disseminated by foreign broadcasters but had no immediate internal repercussions. On December 14th, Laszlo Tőkés, a Hungarian Reformed pastor from the city of Timișoara, received a forced transfer order from Romanian ecclesiastical authorities. Tőkés had publicly criticized government policies of rural systematization that implied demolition of villages with Hungarian and German minority populations. His resistance to the transfer generated solidarity among his parishioners, who decided to protect the pastoral house. On December 16th, hundreds of people congregated in front of Timișoara's Reformed Church to prevent the pastor's eviction. The demonstration initially included members of the local Hungarian community, but gradually expanded, incorporating Romanian citizens discontented with general economic conditions. Local authorities attempted to disperse the concentration through habitual intimidation methods. During the afternoon of December 16th, the protest extended toward Timișoara's center, where demonstrators marched toward the municipal party committee headquarters, shouting slogans against austerity policies and food rationing. Police forces established cordons to contain the mobilization, but the number of participants continued growing as workers leaving factories joined. On December 17th, Ceaușescu declared a state of emergency in Timișoara and ordered General Vasile Milea, defense minister, to restore order through military intervention. Troops received authorization to use firearms against demonstrators. Confrontations intensified when army and Securitate units opened fire against crowds concentrated in the city's central square. Combat continued for 3 days, with an official toll of 97 dead and 300 wounded, although unofficial sources estimated significantly higher figures. Timișoara hospitals received instructions not to provide information about victims. Some corpses were removed during the night and buried in distant localities to hide the magnitude of repression. Images of repression in Timișoara were transmitted by Hungarian and Yugoslav television stations, whose signals reached Romanian territory in border regions. Radio Free Europe and the BBC disseminated eyewitness testimonies describing violence used by security forces. Information gradually circulated to other Romanian cities through informal communications. On December 20th, workers from several Timișoara factories declared a general strike and occupied their work centers. Strikers demanded cessation of repression, removal of local authorities responsible for deaths, and an end to austerity policies that had deteriorated their living conditions. General Nicolae ordered troops to withdraw to barracks, implicitly recognizing loss of control over the situation. Ceaușescu, who was making an official visit to Iran, decided to interrupt his trip and return immediately to Bucharest. His absence during critical events had been interpreted by some sectors as a sign of weakness or disconnection from national reality. The regime needed to demonstrate that it maintained authority and response capacity facing internal challenges. On December 21st, Ceaușescu convened a massive demonstration in Republic Square in Bucharest to demonstrate popular support for the regime and condemn the terrorist elements responsible for Timișoara disturbances. The concentration was organized following habitual procedures. Mandatory participation of workers transported in buses from factories, students mobilized from universities, and public officials with controlled attendance. The rally began at noon with the estimated presence of 120,000 people concentrated in the square and adjacent streets. Ceaușescu began his speech from the Central Committee building balcony, accompanied by Elena and other leaders. His intervention followed the traditional format: denunciation of foreign interference, defense of national sovereignty, and exaltation of Romanian socialism achievements. Approximately 10 minutes after the speech began, shouts and boos were heard from crowd sectors that had not been previously organized by the party. Television cameras, which were broadcasting live, recorded Ceaușescu's visible bewilderment, who interrupted his reading and looked toward Elena seeking guidance. Security services attempted to identify troublemakers, but disorder was spreading. Television transmission was interrupted for several minutes, resuming when Ceaușescu was trying to regain control of the situation through appeasing gestures and promises of salary increases. However, shouting continued and intensified, including slogans directly hostile to the leader. The demonstration, designed to show unanimity, was transforming into a public expression of regime rejection. Around 2 in the afternoon, Ceaușescu abandoned the balcony without completing his speech, while security forces attempted to disperse demonstrators using tear gas and police charges. However, instead of withdrawing, many participants headed toward other areas of Bucharest, incorporating citizens who had not initially attended the official concentration. During the afternoon and night of December 21st, confrontations extended throughout central Bucharest. Demonstrators built barricades, burned police vehicles, and attacked government buildings. Securitate forces responded with shots that caused the first fatal victims in the capital. Hospitals began receiving firearm wounded, confirming that repression had reached lethal levels. On the morning of December 22nd, the situation had escalated toward a generalized insurrection. Workers from important factories like Grivița Roșie and Timpuri Noi abandoned their work positions and marched toward the city center. University students joined the protests, as did government office employees who defied their hierarchical superiors' orders. During the morning of December 22nd, Defense Minister Vasile Milea was found dead in his ministry office. Official versions indicated suicide, but rumors circulated that he had been executed for refusing to order massive repression against Bucharest demonstrators. His death generated confusion in the military chain of command and weakened armed forces cohesion. Army units began changing sides during the morning of December 22nd. Soldiers and officers withdrew their weapons from positions where they protected government buildings and joined demonstrators. Tanks that had been deployed to intimidate the population were used by their crews to protect citizens from sniper fire. Around noon on December 22nd, it became evident that Ceaușescu had lost control over basic state institutions. The Central Committee building was abandoned by its habitual occupants and taken by demonstrators who burst into offices. State television, controlled since morning by technicians and journalists who had joined the insurrectional movement, transmitted improvised messages announcing the regime's fall. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu, accompanied by a reduced group of loyal collaborators, abandoned the Central Committee building at 12:08 on December 22nd via a helicopter waiting on the terrace. The pilot received instructions to head toward a presidential residence in Argeș County, but during flight radio communications reported that several military bases had joined the revolutionary movement. The final trial, the decisive hour in Târgoviște. The helicopter transporting Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu from Bucharest received radio warnings that it would be shot down if it did not land immediately. The pilot, pressured by threats and uncertain military situation, descended in a field near the city of Târgoviște, approximately 80 kilometers north of the capital. The couple attempted to continue their escape using a requisitioned automobile, but was detained by local military forces that had already received orders from the new provisional government. The Ceaușescus were transferred to a military base on Târgoviște's outskirts, where they remained under custody of army units that hours before had been under their authority. Military installations provided security against possible liberation attempts by elements loyal to the regime, although the existence of such forces was questionable in the context of generalized institutional collapse. In Bucharest, the National Salvation Front had assumed control of state institutions under Ion Iliescu's leadership, a former Central Committee member who had maintained distances from Ceaușescu since the 70s. The front presented itself as a provisional government committed to democratic transition, but faced a situation of continued violence that it attributed to terrorists loyal to the previous regime. Combat in Bucharest and other Romanian cities continued during the days following December 22nd. Casualties accumulated from confrontations between regular forces, Securitate elements, and armed groups of uncertain identity. State television transmitted contradictory information about snipers, sabotage, and attacks against public buildings. The number of fatal victims exceeded 1,000, although exact figures remained confused. In this context of instability, the National Salvation Front considered that keeping Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu alive represented a risk of additional destabilization. It was feared that their presence could be used by supposed counter-revolutionary elements to justify continuation of combat. The decision to proceed with an immediate trial was made with the objective of providing definitive resolution to the political crisis. On December 25th, Christmas Day, a military tribunal was organized in the Târgoviște garrison facilities. The procedure was designed to be expeditious, without the habitual formalities of normal judicial processes. Judges were designated among military officers available at the base without specific prior preparation for the case. An effective defense system was not established, nor was time allowed for preparation of arguments. The tribunal was composed of Colonel Gheorghe Andrei as president, Major Nicolae Cosma, and Captain Viorel Moldovianu as associate judges. Military prosecutor Dan Voinea presented the accusation, while Nicolae Teodorescu and Eugeniu Iordăcescu were designated as official defenders. The accused were conducted to the courtroom handcuffed and under heavy military escort. The charges presented against Nicolae Ceaușescu included genocide for deaths caused during demonstration repressions, subversion of state power through establishment of a personal dictatorship, destruction of the national economy through policies that caused hunger and deprivations, illicit enrichment through appropriation of state funds, and attempted escape from the country with public capital. Elena Ceaușescu faced similar charges, with particular emphasis on her participation in fundamental political decisions during the last decades. She was accused of complicity in genocide, participation in state subversion, responsibility in the country's economic destruction, and personal enrichment through improper use of public resources. Nicolae Ceaușescu rejected from the beginning recognizing the tribunal's legitimacy. He declared that he continued being the legitimate president of the Socialist Republic of Romania and that no organ had legal competence to judge him. He insisted that only the Great National Assembly, official parliament of the previous regime, could proceed against him. Throughout the entire session he maintained this position, refusing to answer interrogations or recognize the judge's authority. Elena Ceaușescu adopted a more confrontational attitude, frequently interrupting prosecutors' and judges' interventions with insults and direct challenges. She qualified those present as traitors and collaborators of foreign forces. Her behavior during the trial alternated between angry shouts and categorical refusals to participate in the procedure. She demanded to be treated with honors corresponding to her position as vice president of the State Council. Prosecutor Voinia presented specific accusations related to demonstration repressions in Timișoara and Bucharest, citing the number of fatal victims and wounded. Austerity policies that had caused malnutrition and deterioration of living conditions were mentioned. The existence of foreign bank accounts with funds subtracted from the public treasury was alluded to, although without presenting detailed documentation. The accused systematically denied all charges. Nicolae Ceaușescu rejected responsibility for deaths, arguing that he had attempted to maintain constitutional order facing terrorist elements. He denied the existence of foreign bank accounts and attributed economic difficulties to sabotage and international conspiracies. Elena seconded these denials, adding personal criticisms against tribunal members. The official defense, nominally exercised by designated lawyers, limited itself to pointing out the lack of procedural guarantees and absence of sufficient time to prepare arguments. Defenders indicated that their clients did not recognize the tribunal and requested a legal process with constitutional guarantees. Their participation was merely formal, without effective impact on the procedure's development. During interrogation, Nicolae Ceaușescu intoned fragments of communist songs, including the Internationale. His interventions mixed references to Marxist orthodoxy with affirmations about his constitutional legitimacy. Elena maintained an aggressive tone, refusing to answer specific questions and concentrating on denouncing what she considered a conspiracy against the legitimate government. The tribunal proceeded without considering the accused's objections about its legitimacy. Deliberations were minimal, given the procedure's political objectives. The verdict was announced less than an hour after the session's beginning. Death penalty for both accused, with immediate execution. The sentence was dictated in the name of the Romanian people and without possibility of appeal. The condemned were informed of the decision and immediately conducted outside the courtroom. Nicolae maintained his composure, reiterating that he continued being the country's legitimate president. Elena continued shouting insults against the military and denouncing the procedure's illegitimacy. Both rejected the offer of religious confession before execution. The complete procedure, from the trial's beginning to the sentence announcement, lasted 55 minutes. There was no time for detailed presentation of evidence, witness testimonies, or elaboration of substantive defenses. The objective was to provide an appearance of legality to a decision that had been made for political considerations related to the country's stabilization. The process's rapidity responded both to the military situation's urgency and to the intention of definitively eliminating any possibility of using the Ceaușescu's figure as a symbol of resistance to the new order. The National Salvation Front needed to demonstrate that it had assumed effective control and that the previous regime had ended irreversibly. The televised execution, the brutal end of a regime. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were conducted to the back patio of the Târgoviște military installation immediately after the sentence announcement. The area selected for execution was a reduced space between military buildings, with a brick wall that would serve as execution wall. Conditions reflected the procedure's improvisation. There were no established protocols for executions of this political magnitude. The condemned had their hands tied with ropes available at the military base, including shoelaces used in absence of specific material. An officer offered them blindfolds to cover their eyes, a proposal that both categorically rejected. Nicolae maintained a solemn attitude, while Elena continued uttering insults against the soldiers present. The firing squad was formed with 3 soldiers from the garrison, armed with Kalashnikov automatic rifles. The executors were selected among available military personnel, without specific criteria beyond their presence at the moment. The decision to use automatic weapons instead of traditional execution rifles responded to weapon availability at the installation. At 14 hours and 50 minutes on December 25, 1989, the fire order was given. The 3 soldiers fired simultaneously multiple bursts that impacted the condemned bodies. It is estimated that more than 120 projectiles were fired during execution. Nicolae fell to one side, while Elena remained lying on her back against the wall. Shooting continued several seconds after the bodies had fallen, ensuring death of both condemned. The complete procedure lasted less than 1 minute from squad formation to cease fire. Officers verified absence of vital signs before declaring execution completed. During the procedure, a recording was made with a Soviet video camera available at the military base. The filming equipment was of limited technical quality, producing grainy images with abrupt movements and unstable framing. The recording captured the condemned's transfer, moments prior to shooting and immediate consequences of execution. The shots included trial footage, interrogation fragments, and the accused's conduction to the execution patio. Audio-visual quality was deficient, with distorted sound and unclear images, but sufficient to document the main events. Filming was done by National Salvation Front Instructions, which desired to have visual record of the procedure. Bodies were examined by a military doctor who certified deaths. Nicolae Ceaușescu presented multiple bullet impacts in torso and head. Elena had received projectiles in back and skull. Wounds were fatal, and death had been instantaneous according to medical verdict. Corpses were covered with military blankets and transferred to temporary storage. In Bucharest, combat continued during the afternoon of December 25th. The National Salvation Front maintained radio communications with military units throughout the country, coordinating operations against supposed hostile elements. State television transmitted continuous messages about the situation's evolution, mixing confirmed information with rumors about counter-revolutionary activities. The execution recording was immediately transferred to Bucharest via military flight. Front authorities decided to transmit fragments of the material as definitive proof of regime change. Broadcasting was scheduled for the following day, allowing time for basic editing and preparation of explanatory comments. On December 26th, Romanian state television interrupted its regular programming to transmit images of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu's trial and execution. The emission began with military tribunal fragments, showing the accused rejecting the procedure's legitimacy and denying charges presented against them. Trial scenes revealed the couple's physical deterioration during their detention days. Nicolae appeared disheveled, with wrinkled clothes and tense expression. Elena showed herself verbally aggressive, constantly interrupting judges' and prosecutors' interventions. Both contrasted dramatically with official images that had dominated media for decades. Execution fragments were transmitted briefly, showing moments immediately after shooting. Images included bodies lying in the military installation patio, visually confirming both leaders' death. The recording's deficient technical quality did not prevent clearly identifying victims. Transmission reached massive audiences throughout Romanian territory. Millions of citizens witnessed for the first time direct images of the regime's end that had controlled their lives for more than 2 decades. Reactions varied from relief to shock, passing through confusion at events' rapidity. In many localities, population went to streets after transmission, celebrating the regime's end or simply expressing tension accumulated during years of repression. In other zones, caution predominated, facing political uncertainty and combat continuation. Television became the main information medium about national crisis evolution. Images were retransmitted by international television stations, providing global coverage to Romanian events. European and American news agencies reproduced fragments, converting execution into a worldwide media event. Image brutality contrasted with peaceful transitions occurred in other Eastern Bloc countries. Transmissions served as psychological control instrument for the new government. By showing former leaders' corpses, an unequivocal message was sent about political change, irreversibility. Public exhibition of death functioned as symbolic closure ritual of the previous period. International human rights organizations immediately criticized the trial's summary nature and execution. Amnesty International and the European Commission denounced violation of basic procedural guarantees and application of capital punishment without due process. Criticisms centered on absence of effective defense and procedure rapidity. Western jurists pointed out that the tribunal did not meet minimum impartiality standards. There had not been sufficient time for defense preparation, evidence presentation, or appeal possibility. The procedure resembled more a political act than a legitimate judicial process. In Romania, however, immediate priority was internal situation stabilization. Combat continued sporadically for several days after execution, although with decreasing intensity. The National Salvation Front used the Ceaușescu's elimination as argument to demonstrate that the old regime had ended definitively. Nicolae and Elena's bodies were initially buried in Bucharest's Ghencea cemetery under false identities to avoid tombs becoming pilgrimage places. Authorities feared that nostalgic sectors of the previous regime would use sepulchres as resistance symbols to the new political order. The executed couple's children were arrested and processed for charges related to corruption and power abuse. Nicolae Ceaușescu, who had occupied important political positions, received a 20-year prison sentence. Zoya and Valentin, with less prominent roles in the regime, obtained lesser sentences but lost their academic and professional positions. The People's Palace, architectural symbol of the previous regime's megalomania, was converted into seat of the new Romanian parliament. The building, still incomplete at the revolution moment, required additional years of work for its completion. Its colossal size and excessive cost converted it into permanent reminder of Ceaușescu period excesses. Securitate archives began being declassified gradually, revealing the surveillance network extension that had controlled Romanian society. Documents showed infiltration scope in institutions, families, and social circles. Thousands of citizens discovered they had been spied on by neighbors, colleagues, or even relatives. Romanian political transition prolonged for years, complicated by continuity of many previous regime cadres in authority positions. Ion Iliescu, National Salvation Front leader, was elected president in 1990 elections, maintaining power until 1996, with a brief interval between 1996 and 2000. Investigations about December 1989 revolution circumstances continued for decades, without reaching definitive conclusions about several controversial aspects. Identity of snipers who caused victims during combat, Defense Minister Vasile Milea's death and real existence of terrorist forces loyal to Ceaușescu remained as unresolved questions. In 2010, after exhumations and DNA tests, Nicolae Ceaușescu's remains' identity was officially confirmed. Elena was reburied alongside her husband in a ceremony that reopened debates about the regime's legacy and summary execution justice. The 20th anniversary of their death generated reflections about Romanian democratic transition and its limitations. Execution recording continued circulating in international media as historical document of communism's fall in Eastern Europe. Images maintained their visual impact, representing the violent end of a regime that had exercised totalitarian control over Romanian society for a quarter century.